Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on meta leadership. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Smith and Mr. Rob Enderle. Thank you for joining today's sessions. My first questions to Mr. David. Uh, what are the key principles of meta leadership and how does it differ from traditional leadership model?
Well, Sharif, thank you for the questions and thank you for allowing me to be on your program today. And it's an honor, privilege to be on it with Rob today. The meta leadership is it's really a framework that looks at new approaches, way to kind of transcend traditional leadership boundaries that most of us understand in business and politics and life. And some of the key principles of it is the person who's uh, using it and applying it is self-awareness. Self-awareness and self-actualization is a key part of it. Meta leaders really need to deeply understand their emotions, their motivations, what their biases are, and understand more of a 360 view of their self-awareness than traditional leadership models do. Another key principle of meta leadership is emotional intelligence. And one of the things that COVID hurt most in our lives, in our businesses, in our schooling and things is emotional intelligence. But in meta leadership, the people manage their reactions uh, in a very emotionally intelligent manner, and they inspire confidence, even in times of great uncertainty. Uh, the Another key principle of meta leadership for people is personal growth. Again, Shrieky, we talk all the time about lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is a key principle of meta leadership because it's constantly learning and reflection on what is vital, what is important, what is the help them to excel to refine their leadership skills. Another key principle of meta leadership is the situation. Um, just like I was talking about in the last point, meta leaders really strive to understand and assess the context of the challenges they're facing, identifying the key dynamics, the key, in my words, careabouts that are necessary to to excel on this. Who are the stakeholders, and what are the wide range of potential solutions? One of the characteristics from my work in the past for a meta leader, as you begin to look like this, is in my views of the future, they are counterpunchers because they really want to understand the multiple scenarios that can take place and what are their options and actions around those multiple scenarios there. And then they adapt their leadership style based on the situational needs, balancing the urgency to act versus the long-term strategy. Uh, a couple of other quick things is for a meta leader is connectivity. They work and maintain networks that span organizations, sectors, disciplines, geographical areas. They truly look at it uh, in the context of a Renaissance man, I guess is one way to describe it. And but meta leaders foster collaboration, and they want to align these groups towards shared goals and towards that same group intelligence. And you asked about how it compares more to traditional leadership models. Traditional models typically focus on leading within a single organization or a single team, where meta leadership emphasizes leading across boundaries, integrating many different perspectives and resources, and really work that way. Uh, Traditional models of leadership really heavily rely on hierarchies and strategies built around the hierarchies. And, some people will say bureaucracy, but even the agile approaches is a traditional approach based on that. Meta leadership, though, is a dynamic, uh, evolving to meet fluid situations. It thrives in complexity, and the adaptivity makes the ideally suited for places where there's chaos and chaos theory is playing. Traditional leadership prioritizes really management, it prioritizes authority and control, where meta leadership, as I was saying, prioritizes collaborating with others, empowering others, building that group intelligence, understanding those care abouts, and building the alliances that are necessary to work there. And the final difference is meta leadership is designed for navigating the crisis and the challenges that require multi-sector responses, such as public health emergencies, environmental disaster, periods of conflict, and others, where traditional leadership styles struggle some in those. So, in essence, meta leadership moves beyond the traditional leader follower type of paradigm and focuses on the shared responsibilities, that group intelligence, the innovation, and system-wide impact. Uh, and so, Sharif, I think that's not a bad first answer.
Thank you. My next question for Mr. Rob. How can meta leadership help leaders navigate complex and uncertain environments such as economic crisis or technological disruptions?
Well, as David pointed out, the difference with meta leadership is this: it's a much more holistic view on the environment. To give you an example, I just recently attended a conference, Intel Vision, and part of that conference was talking about automotive companies and the difference the Chinese companies have to the U.S. companies. U.S. companies, to a large extent, and I shouldn't say U.S., I should say Western companies, because it's pretty much consistent across Western automotive companies, is that Western automotive companies use a matrix leadership style, a matrix organizational style, where you've got lots of individual fiefdoms, each working on different components and hopefully coming together at the end to create an automobile. And the time it takes to create an automobile in a Western automotive company is anywhere from 3 to 7 years to go from concept to delivered automobile. And in a Western automotive company, they do the hardware purchasing first. So they select the technology they're going to put in the car at the beginning of that process. And of course, by the end of that 3 to 7 years, that technology is 3 to 7 years old. Now we go to a Chinese company, it's very different. A Chinese company is not a matrix company. It's much more of a what I would call an even older style company, in that you've got management at the top, a clear line of authority that goes throughout the organization. And for them, purchasing is the back end of the process. So they develop the automobile, they write the software, they do everything that's needed, and at the end, they select the hardware that goes through it. And so when a Chinese car comes out, it takes between 9 and 18 months as opposed to 3 to 7 years to create the automobile. And number two, when the Chinese car comes out, it's using current technology. So when a Chinese car ships, the technology within the car is the technology that has just hit the market from the technology providers. And so that allows a company like BYD to deliver an automobile that is vastly more advanced than a car from a typical Western technology leader at a far lower price, which is why if we didn't have tariffs, the Chinese car companies would pretty much be eating up the world at the moment. It's just they're far faster, far more capable. And so if you look at the structure, they're looking at the thing more holistically, and they're organizing the company against the goal, much more high efficiency. They care about the workers and their opinions. The linear management style allows for much greater direction. They're much faster. They're much more agile. Granted, they kind of have to work on their naming, but that naming aside, it allows them to address the market in a much faster fashion. If I were to give an analogy in the military, probably be the difference between the British military during the U.S. War of Independence against the Minutemen. The Minutemen were small groups moving much more agilely, responding much more effectively, and management and the workers and the people that should manage them, the soldiers, or I should say, officers and soldiers were much more closely aligned, and the structure was much flatter, and you didn't have to get much more approvals. As a matrix organization has to have. I worked in IBM when matrix was high, and I remember for one particular product we're trying to bring out, it took 23,000 people to sign off on it before you could bring the product to market, and that is not how you approach it with a meta style of management. A meta style of management focuses you on the result, not on the structure. You have less complexity. You have much more cooperation and partnering within the organization. Where in your typical matrix organization, you have lots of fiefdoms. The fiefdoms are constantly fighting for resources. They don't want to cooperate and carry forward. In fact, to really drive home the dichotomy between the two management styles would be to look at, say, how GE's methodologies kind of flowed through the industry, with forced ranking being one of the core tenets that came out of the GE learning. And forced ranking was a way to fix a particular problem in GE, which was resulting in people being held in positions far too long and with too little oversight. But what it did is it forced individuals against each other. It actually created a competition between workers, and so you couldn't get cooperation. You couldn't get, if I had to give up something so that somebody else could be successful, that was something you didn't do. And if that person being successful was to the benefit of the product or the effort, still that was something you didn't know. You were measured and compensated based on your individual performance or the performance of your group, to the exclusion of everything else. That's not what happens in a meta management structure. In meta management structure, the compensation goes to how you're contributing to the whole, not how you're just contributing to yourself and your own entire group. The entire effort is to drive people together in a much more cooperative way to create a far better outcome. So in a way, if meta management's done right, the employees are happier, they're much more productive, the company moves much more quickly. It falls in within that management envelope that China is currently demonstrating with their automotive efforts, and moves away from this middle style capability that kind of treats employees like cogs in a machine, and as if you had a kingdom with multiple fiefdoms, each one competing with each other to create something that sometimes is very ethereal. I guess the best example of how a matrix organization fails would be the Pontiac Aztek, which was created by a lot of groups, each with a great idea of how a car should be, and the result was, at least as last I checked, the worst car that was ever brought to market. That shows the failings of the matrix management structure, and why a meta management structure or a meta leadership structure is far better, because it focuses better on the whole, and it treats people like people. It treats the individual components as important. In fact, I will give one more example, and that's probably under the Thomas Watson Jr. Management structure of IBM. This is before we called anything meta leadership. What Thomas Watson would do was he would individually go to the sites, and he would talk to the rank and file employees, and he would ask them how they fit within the organization and how they contributed to the whole. And if they couldn't answer that question, and believe me, in a matrix organization, almost nobody can answer that question, he wouldn't punish the employee. He would brutalize their management, and often either replace them or severely penalize them for not doing their job, which was to make sure the employees knew how they contributed, brought the employees together collaboratively to drive the whole. And that's why IBM actually operated so much better under the Watsons than it did subsequently, as it moved to these secondary styles of management, where rewards shifted to individuals and away from the company goals. So meta leadership, as it's conceived, is a much better way of treating the company as kind of a whole body, as an entity that's moving towards a common goal, a common effort, and where every aspect of the company is important, and is treated as important. The final concept with meta management is how you assure employee loyalty, how you ensure employee happiness, and in the end, the underlying concept of meta leadership is really assuring a work-life balance, because that better assures the employee is performant. That better ensures that when you're trying to create something, they can do so more quickly. So, in terms of comparing companies, I believe the Chinese companies are much closer to the meta leadership model than U.S. companies are now, and that's why at the end of that session I was mentioning as I started out, the consensus of the analysts is that most of the Western car companies are going to be out of business by 2030, and the Chinese companies that are moving much faster, much more agilely, and much more capably are going to eat them alive, with or without tariffs, because right now those Chinese companies are operating at a 10-year advantage, and they're only accelerating, while the Western companies are having real trouble juggling their different initiatives, balancing between gas cars and electric cars, and finding it very hard to bring things to market timely.
Thank you, Dr. Tamanna. What you want to discuss about meta leadership? And if you share few of your views from India.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess meta leadership framework and practice method is designed to provide guidance, direction, and momentum across organizational lines and develop into a shared course of action and commonality of purpose among people and agencies that are doing what may appear to be very different work. Meta leadership has been derived through observation and analysis of leaders in crisis situations. It's basically the crisis situation people realize that what kind of leadership we really want, and it basically started with the September 11 attack in the US. The focus on national preparedness has subsequently been distilled for general application, though it remains useful to crisis leaders, particularly given current and persistent natural and man-made threats requiring the coordination of multiple agencies and organizations in preparation, response, and recovery. Meta leadership reframes the practice of leadership by providing, firstly, a comprehensive organizing framework for understanding and integrating the many facets of leadership. Secondly, a method for catalyzing collaborative activity. And thirdly, a focus on improving function and performance across organizational and sector boundaries. The framework of this particular thing was developed by Leonard Marcus and Dawn of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a joint program of Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard John F. K. School of Government. The need for such an expansive view of leadership was driven by the increased complexity of natural and man made threats facing the US. The challenge was illustrated by the inadequate response to Hurricane Katrina that revealed profound system weakness. So, I guess as a framework premised on integrating theory and practice through ongoing research, teaching, and field observation, meta leadership has evolved over time as reflected in published works. And so now, if we would look at the difference between leadership and meta leadership, as a framework and practice method meta leadership draws upon and integrates a large variety of extant leadership scholarship, including that on transformation leadership, shared leadership and followership, and others. Meta leadership is distinct in that it focuses on cross-cutting leadership that generates connectivity among disparate stakeholders in both intra and inter-organizational settings. So, I mean, the three dimensions of meta leadership are, firstly, the person of the meta leadership develops high self-awareness, self-knowledge, and self-regulation. I guess this is, I mean, if you could relate this to many spiritual leaders, in India right now, I mean, these people are taught, the spiritual gurus go to these companies and give them the right kind of initiation into understanding what the level of leadership should be. and how should a leader treat, for example, the people who are who are the employees. So the leadership is taught in that way. I mean, right now, if you'll see many of the law schools, etc., they invite people from different areas of spiritualism, who come and guide them, how should they keep, because the stress is so much in the world right now. To understand that how to deal with stress, we need a system whereby you have the right kind of mental setup to deal with this thing. Then, and the stress basically, and leading across to peers and inter-organization units to foster collaboration and coordination. So all these spiritual gurus, what they do is they kind of train people into collaboration and coordination and stress-free life, which is much better required. And in India, for example, most MNCs, law schools, MBA schools are inviting people from spiritual backgrounds. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. My next question for you: what role does emotional intelligence play in a meta leadership, and how can leaders develop it to improve decision making and collaboration? Can you unmute, please?
David, you're muted.
Sorry, I was trying to be good with muting. Dr. Sharif, as we mentioned before, emotional intelligence is very, very important in today's time. And it was one of the things that suffered a lot during the COVID era. And as we get there, and emotional intelligence really is kind of part of the capstone of meta leadership. And it's one of the tools, along with the lifelong learning, the collaboration, others, that leaders need to navigate the complex environments that meta leadership excels at. And it's one of the major tools to help enhance the collaboration that is necessary, that can be effectively done in that role. So again, some of the roles of emotional intelligence in meta leadership really starts, I think, at first with that self-awareness. And leaders which have a high emotional intelligence and a high EQ as well are attuned to their own emotions, their strengths, their limitations. They are very good about taking this self-awareness to help them remain composed, to help them be level-headed and inclusive, particularly in crisis, and make decisions that have a minimal amount of emotional bias in them. And this self-awareness is a key part of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence also enables leaders to be self-regulating and to manage their emotional responses and their stability. One of the things, if you look at real world examples of where meta leadership has been applied, it really helps the leaders reassure their teams and the stakeholders that what they're doing is a deliberate process, and it prevents panic and oftentimes not well thought out, hasty decisions. Another role of emotional intelligence and meta leadership is empathy and caring and understanding. Meta leaders prioritize really understanding the emotions of their stakeholders, their employees, and others, and what their perspectives are. You've heard me many times in your program, Dr. Sharif, talk about the concept of care abouts. Meta leadership really excels in trying to understand the care abouts of others. not just the tangible parts of the care abouts of others, but also the intangibles, which very often intangibles are one of the most important things, particularly in times of complex decisions. Uh, a couple of other ones in this area is that meta leaderships, when I began to look at emotional intelligence, they have strong social skills. They know how to build relationships. They understand the stakeholders. And this is really a critical meta leadership quality because part of meta leadership is you have to collaborate across boundaries, whether it's geographical boundaries, organizational boundaries, cultural boundaries, whether it's thought patterns or disciplinary patterns or others. This social skills is really essential. And one other place where emotional intelligence and meta leadership is really important is motivation. Emotional intelligent leaders inspire each other and inspire others by showing genuine enthusiasm. They're resilient. They are not just a cheerleader, but they're the leader of the group. They share a sense of purpose, even in challenging situation. And you know, they begin to do this by different ways. They cultivate mindfulness with people. They seek the care abouts and the feedback on those care abouts. They listen well and they ask open-ended questions. And those are some of the things that really are critical as you begin to look at that. They enhance really the way to mitigate and turn conflict into a positive because they want to understand that all parties are heard and valued and that this type of group intelligence exceeds there. And one of the other key parts of emotional intelligence, and it's amplified more in the meta leadership style, is they have to foster that learning environment. So they really work with that to enhance the capabilities of the organization they're dealing with. And emotional intelligence really matters a lot in decision making, in collaboration. In decision making, it minimizes quickly thought out short reactions because it really promotes more of a thoughtful, balanced decision in there. And in collaboration, it really builds trust. It builds the empathy. It builds the sense of team and being heard and understood. It helps bring really diverse teams together, particularly since in many of the situations where meta leadership is applied, it's in very complex environments, crisis environments, and others like that. And so it really pulls those together. It helps that people feel valued, which improves communication. And meta leadership, when applied correctly, particularly with emotional intelligence, it really encourages innovation, problem solving. And so, as I said before, it's you begin to look at both the tangibles and the intangibles. And emotional intelligence is not just a soft skill, it's a necessary skill to be effective and productive in today's complex and fast moving environment.
Thank you. My next questions to Mr. Rob. How can meta leadership be applied to foster cross-sectors collaboration between business, government, and academic institutions?
Well, so that's the nature of meta leadership. It's holistic in its approach. So the whole point to it is, regardless if you're collaborating with internal or external organizations, the meta leader is focused on making sure everybody's on the same page and working in the same direction. So whether you're talking, it's much less adversarial. It's focused on collaboration, not conflict. More traditional leadership styles often have what I used to call the biggest asshole at the table winning. The loudest voice, the person that has the title, right or wrong, wins the argument. I remember working for Siemens for a period of time where that practice was self-evident, and it's really a horrible environment to be in, because you get people that literally know nothing about what it is that's going on, providing direction, and then using the force of their voice or the force of their status to drive the outcome, which generally fails, and there it failed spectacularly, running up a $5 billion loss on the project we were working on. And so the meta leader is looking at these external organizations as a path to a solution as opposed to obstacles to overcome, and then thinking about ways to assure that path is viable. And so in many ways, the skills that are being used are much more manipulative in terms of effect, and much less using the power of positioning to drive the outcome, so that people are moving the same direction ostensibly because they want to. They've been manipulated to want to go with you, as opposed to being ordered or beat about the head to do that, and where efforts are being made to assure that everyone benefits, as opposed to efforts being made to assure the person driving the effort is the predominant beneficiary. So it's less about it's much less about individual progress and more about progress towards a common goal, and that's what really makes it different. It's really trying to think of. I mean, I guess the difference in terms of looking at countries, it would be meta leadership. It would be more along the lines of diplomacy, where more traditional leadership is more along the lines of warfare. Both can accomplish individual goals, but diplomacy can generally accomplish those goals faster, cheaper, and with far less loss of life than warfare. And so the underlying methodologies of meta leadership are much more cooperative, much more holistic, much more taking into account every aspect that has to come together to make it go. We used to talk about critical paths, and looking for where the areas were that could cause an underlying issue. The meta leader is very much aware of the critical paths and alleviating those bottlenecks. The more traditional leader may try to drive through or ignore the critical paths and has a much higher, in my view, chance of failure. Giving another example from my past, I was involved in a bid between Microsoft, a bid of Microsoft to Rockwell International, and I was asked to come in and review it. And Rockwell International, I believe the product was Exchange, and Rockwell had 5 divisions. 3 divisions wanted to deploy Exchange, or were neutral. 2 divisions hated it, and so the management team decided that their approach was going to go to the divisions that were positive or neutral and work on them, because they didn't really want to mess with the ones that were negative. Yet all 5 divisions had to approve, and as a result, after $3 million of effort, Microsoft lost the bid. And anybody looking at that would have said that was clear from the outcome. They didn't need to spend the $3 million to accomplish that. But that's because they tried to drive it through. They tried to force it through. 3 against 2 was going to win, when that wasn't the structure at all. The meta leadership would have put their effort on the 2 divisions that were not on board first, and created a collaborative environment and tried to spin them. And if they concluded that they couldn't spin the 2 divisions, would likely exited the process as non-viable, where the traditional leader would try to use force, as Microsoft did, to accomplish that goal, waste the $3 million, and also fail. So the meta leader is much more aware of the dynamics of the people of the organizations that must be in alignment, and would focus more of their effort on those that are off step to bring them on board and manipulate them to be favorable to the outcome. Where the traditional leader is much more likely to use force, the authority of their station, or the power of their company to accomplish the same goal, with a much lower probability of success and a much higher probability of catastrophic failure. So that's how I would compare how a traditional leader would approach the regulatory bodies, government bodies, as opposed to a more traditional leader in trying to achieve the same outcome.
Thank you, Mr. David. My next question for you: what are some real-world examples of leaders successfully applying meta leadership principle to drive innovation and global impact?
Rob and I both have used several examples as we've gone through the topic with you today, Dr. Strait. But some others that are really interesting is if I go back here in the United States to the Boston Marathon bombing that happened back in 2013. Uh, During that challenge there, leaders from various sectors, law enforcement, healthcare, government, the sports community, families, multiple stakeholders, not just in the city of Boston, but across the state and actually across the nation, came together to collaborate seamlessly to kind of manage the crisis. Because this response really showcased the meta leadership principles like cross-sector collaboration, cross-sector communications, rapid learning, situational awareness, and it was a great case study of how leaders build trust, how you coordinate resources, and how do you really put together communication plans to protect public safety, to uh, get the appropriate responses, to maintain a sense of order, but a sense of reactiveness from a really situation that was non-predicted and very chaotic. And it really helped foster community resilience. Another great example is some of the COVID-19 vaccine developments, where it exemplified some of the meta leadership style. You saw the pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, the government, and academic institutions, and big companies, small companies, uh, communication groups coming together to work together to accelerate research, to accelerate regulatory approval, sometimes too fast, as we know now, but to really help accelerate that and to really use a meta leadership principle to look on how to do global distribution of the vaccines. Um, and it really collaborated the importance of the shared purpose, which is one of the key uh, elements of meta leadership, and of the collaboration and the empathy on part of that. And it highlighted really how to bring diverse expertise to address this global health crisis. And if you look at part of how the response there, it actually amplified some of the concepts of a technopolis type of approach on a global basis as opposed to a regional basis. A couple more examples, I think, can be used there. Uh, I saw a Harvard article on this several months ago, and one of their examples was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and how part of their management style and their stated management style in the foundation is meta leadership principles, where it collaborates with governments, businesses, and NGOs to track really and surveil the global challenges like poverty, education, public health, and how they use these principles and the learning principles and others to create partnerships in things like trying to wipe out polio and looking at how cross-sector collaborations can achieve, in some instances, these type of transformational outcomes. And another one, which is kind of closer to me here, is if you look at SpaceX and the leadership styles at SpaceX, they really look at how to reflect meta leadership here by bridging the private sector and the government, for example, NASA, to advance space exploration, and how to look at things outside the traditional box. Now, if I went back and looked at NASA with their approach of single-use type of launch vehicles and others versus SpaceX's reusable rocket technology, and how vastly different they are. But by using a meta leadership approach, it can really help you see how collaboration and the principles of meta leadership can be applied to drive innovation, which can have not just global impact, but impacts off of the planet of Earth as we begin to look at going back to the moon and going to Mars and others. And just these few examples really can help illustrate how meta leadership principles, the connectivity, the working across the diverse stakeholders, understanding their careabouts, and adapting to the complex challenges can really make a fairly significant difference in the world.
Thank you. My next question for Mr. Rob. How does meta leadership help leaders navigating crisis situation, and what strategies can be used to maintain trust and coordination among stakeholders?
Well, so when you create a cooperative structure and you have a crisis, you have the ability to pivot everyone towards the crisis, and I mean, a meta leadership structure should be more agile because you can more easily pivot people that are more willing to follow the meta leader to reach a conclusion. Often, what happens in a company when you have a crisis is a lot of efforts going in to find the person to blame for the crisis. In other words, one of the first efforts you do is, okay, who's screwed up and how do we shoot them? And which is kind of screwy because in some cases the person made a mistake, but that person is much less likely after that mistake to make another similar one. I mean, and yet a lot of the effort is to get rid of them, and the new person that comes in hasn't had that experience, and is much more likely to make the same mistake. Granted, there are some people that make sequential mistakes and don't learn from their problems, in which case they should be terminated. But often in traditional management, the focus is on finding blame first or avoiding blame, and not on correcting the problem. And that's often why problems can become far worse than they would need to be, because the effort is to initially cover it up. I think what happened at Intel with Larrabee, Intel had a graphics effort back in the 90s. It was called Larrabee, and the effort was to try to create a graphics competitor to NVIDIA, which was the stronger graphics player at the time. And everything looked just hunky-dory. The teams were outperforming metrics. There were no problems coming out of the group. And a lot of us that were covering this at the time were in the dark as to how bad things were, because the efforts within the Meta group were to cover up problems, not identify and attack them. And the traditional leadership model, which is you punish the people that are making mistakes, means that you don't want to admit that you screwed up. You want to cover it up as much as possible. And Pat Gelsinger, who was again just left Intel, back then because he had been made the head of Larrabee towards the end of that process, was completely unaware that it was off the rails. And the clear indicators it was off the rails stuff was too good. I mean, no complex effort has no errors. No complex effort has no problems. And the red flag was the reports were all just too good. There should have been problems, and because there weren't, somebody should have gone in there. I spent a lot of time in internal audit at IBM, and this was a constant headache. If you were looking for problems rather than looking for places that were calling up errors, you really want to look at the areas that were showing just crystal clean and everything was going great, because those were the areas where the problems were undoubtedly unknown and likely going to come up and bite you in the ass. And so the meta leadership model, which is focused on collaboration, moving forward and overarching goals, is much more capable of addressing a catastrophe or a problem than a more traditional model, which is much more focused on dodging blame or applying blame to wherever it applies. And my personal view is, when you're all over and you're out of the crisis, then you can talk about blame and punishment. But when you're trying to address the crisis, it's all hands on board, focus on correcting the problem. It's kind of like after the Titanic hit the iceberg. That's not the time to start yelling at the captain and firing the command crew. That's the time to get everybody in the lifeboats and get everybody safe. And so the meta leader would be focused on, okay, we've hit the iceberg. What do we do next, and how do we save the most people? The traditional leadership model is, okay, how do we cover up the problem? How do we dodge the responsibility? And how do we individually survive regardless of what happens to everybody else? And so in the meta model, you get a much more focused attempt to correct the problem, to address the catastrophe, to mobilize against the threat. And with the traditional model, a lot of effort's wasted on shooting people that often had nothing to do with the problem, that are just in a bad position, either politically or organizationally, and are easily disposed of. Another example was the effort we had a while back for creating risk managers. And the idea of a risk manager was somebody that managed the risk of the company and was focused on that risk. But what that became a blame magnet, and so the risk managers, who had absolutely no authority, when you had a catastrophe, everybody pointed at the risk manager and said it was their fault because it was their job to fix the risk. Yet they had no authority to actually do much of anything. And so we could fire the risk manager, and yes, we made progress, without even addressing the catastrophe or the causes of it. And so that's often why companies have reoccurring catastrophic mistakes, is because they're focused so much on punishing the guilty and not really focusing that much on even finding if the person's actually guilty or not. And an inadequate focus on understanding the problem, correcting the problem, and make sure it doesn't recur. So the meta leadership model really focuses much more on fixing stuff, on addressing the catastrophe, and much less on finding blame and finding somebody to shoot and punish for whatever it was that happened. So it's as organizationally, it's a much better place to work for employees, because it's much less likely you're going to get shot for something you had no control over.
Thank you. My next question for Mr. David Smith, in what ways can meta leadership be applied in cross-section collaborations and climate change and AI governance?
The answer by Rob and my last answer began to get into this topic on that as you try to apply it. And one of the key concepts of meta leadership is establishing shared goals. And you bring together the diverse stakeholders in ways to identify the common objectives. And you look at particularly ones that transcend the traditional boundaries. Since Rob used the example of Intel, I'm going to use an Intel example as well in this one. We were brought in as consultants to Intel when they were trying to get into part of the telecommunications marketplace. And it was really interesting looking at them, because Intel was primarily a semiconductor company and did not really begin to understand it. But when we went in there with them, they thought they had all the answers. Their internal teams had looked. They looked at that. But the company I was with at the time was a company called Technology Futures. And we actually ran something called the Telecommunication Technology Forecasting Group, which was all the major telecoms, and had been expert witnesses before PUCs and the FCC and places like that. And we went in there and told them basically that some of their approaches wouldn't hold water. And they got really upset with us, because they knew they had better knowledge than the industry had. And so what you saw there was where meta leadership could have gone in and been applied to help them in situations like that. It was very interesting. They dropped their telecom business and their modem business and stuff shortly after that because they were wanting to do telephones, they wanted to do video conferencing, all types of stuff like that in an industry that they really didn't understand. And that type of things is a great example of looking at how to take these goals and begin to get there. And, you know, if you look at climate change as your question, the leaders need to put unite the governments, unite the NGOs, the businesses, the education around some shared goals of how to promote sustainable practices, how to have an impact there of reducing carbon and others. But they have to do it in the context of understanding the care-abouts there to those goals. AI governance, great complex problem today because it's moving so fast. And so what meta leaders need to do is align the policymakers, the technology developers, the people looking at the ethics of it, the ones who are looking at how to build models that are accurate, and to really establish these shared goals for what will become AI frameworks to build it. Now, if you look at meta leadership, you have to build this connectivity across the sectors. And there have been convening summits where businesses share innovations in things like renewable energy, where different governments have proposed what they're thinking the regulatory frameworks can be in, where academia brings in both their research insights and their thoughts of how to tie those together going forward. You know, AI governance, boy, that's still a tough one, because you're seeing think tanks which are being put in place to connect AI developers with legal experts, human rights people, academics, regulatory and others. But today in AI in particular, it's moving so fast and it's so competitive that it has become a nation playing field as opposed to just a company playing field. But meta leadership can help build that connectivity across those sectors as long as those stakeholder care-abouts are recognized and if they can be overcome. Another thing you see in these, a couple of other ones is meta leadership likes to leverage knowledge, leverage expertise. So you see them in the two examples you put on the table, Dr. Shreve, where you're trying to pull together knowledgeable stakeholders to implement, for example, in climate change policies like carbon taxes, businesses innovating, academics coming together to advance climate science and try to analyze the policy impacts, try to help advance what business and government's doing together to innovate. In AI, you're seeing some places where meta leadership is trying to help develop transparency tools and ethical AI systems. And those should be working hand in hand with governments to help put regulations in place, or at least models in place, to prevent misuse and particularly the very bad biases we're still seeing today. But again, this is something that has to be done on a global basis, which makes this the complex type of problems that meta leadership is good for. And this type of complex problem is where, for example, in AI, academia can really conduct some interdisciplinary research on what is the societal impacts of AI and what it's doing. We're seeing quite a bit of that on the number of jobs that are being eliminated, but we don't see a lot of it today on well, how do you recover? How do you do the reskilling, the re-education? And meta leaderships is really good at helping bridge the gaps between these competing interests and the cultural disparities. In climate, it's the differences between economic growth and environment preservation. And AI, it's how do you balance innovation, moving fast, with the regulatory environment that needs to be there to provide protection. And how do you do this when you're driving a collaborative innovation area? So again, in AI, it's how do you collaborate to develop these AI ethical standards, the accountability frameworks, how to be inclusive in that. The same thing is you have to drive those same things in climate change with this collaborative innovation, such as carbon capture initiatives or ways to approach new ways to tackle some of the problems, such as using kinetic energy as opposed to some of the other approaches to generate energy. And again, how do you use the meta leadership things to sustain long-term collaboration? In both of the examples we've asked about, they require long-term efforts because those are not easy problems. Climate change is how do you put in place long-term collaborations and things like monitoring and adapting regulatory across the globe. And how do you establish international coalitions, particularly in AI, to oversee ethical practices? And you're going to see those. So, a good example in both of these are things like in AI, we're seeing something called open AI, where government bodies, academic institutions are coming together to try to work on ethical AI development. In that one of the key stated things in their charter is they want to balance innovation with societal impacts. So they understand that you've got to have both of those. On the climate change, a place that is often cited is the Paris Accord, and how the Paris Accord was trying to balance these collaborative elements to come together to work with it, and particularly both AI and the environmental climate change are all those complex problems where they cross so many different sectors and so many boundary lines that those cross-sector collaboration is not only necessary, it's imperative. So Dr. Sharif, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. My last question for Mr. Rob. How can emerging technologies such as AI and blockchain enhance or challenge the principle of meta leadership in modern organization?
So I'm a big believer in having the tools follow the problem, not the tools lead the problem. But having, because and I'm struggling a bit with blockchain as a result. Blockchain is a distributed ledger, but as I thought about it, there is a way that I think you could use blockchain to assure meta leadership. Blockchain helps manage and record and create a record of transactions. And with any organization, you do have a transactional environment. People make commitments and are expected to then fulfill those commitments. And often that's not the case. I still remember talking to one of the folks that was two managers above me, and he sat me down and said, your problem is you make commitments, and some of those commitments are really difficult. You may not make them. And he says the right way to survive, and this is an IBM, the right way to survive an IBM is find a way to make no commitments. That way nobody will hold you accountable. And of course, to this day, I have no idea what his group did. And I doubt anybody else did either, including his group. But they just floated along. Nobody got promoted, but nobody got fired either. So no risk, no reward. With blockchain, you could record commitments, show who the commitments were made to, and then record when those commitments were met. In other words, show that the transaction was open and remained open until it was closed. And as long as you were reporting those open transactions as not closed, those would have a priority, and you'd be able to focus on the nails that weren't being pounded in. So I think that would be how you'd use blockchain in a meta leadership format as a way to assure commitments were being made and assure commitments were being met. And with a trigger being that the commitments were falling out of line falling outside their timelines, it would allow you to put resources against it. And often in companies, and I've seen this both in my time in management and my time in audit, is the organizations that are making commitments aren't staffed or resourced in a way to achieve those commitments. So you're looking, because and often it doesn't seem to matter to management. My view of audit was less the traditional view where you go in and you basically it's shooting fish in a barrel. You're looking for people that overcommitted and were under-resourced, and you call them out as being incompetent. But my view was that wasn't the group's fault. That was management's fault. But management's duty is to assure that the groups that are doing the job are properly resourced. If they're not properly resourced, that's not the individual's fault. And we often had people that were trying to do the job, or 5 or 10 people, and they're just working themselves to death. I knew one woman, I mean, she literally worked 18-hour days, 6 to 7 day weeks, and she was killing herself. And yet management, she was doing the work, so management gave her more of it. And that is not the way you manage people. You don't want to kill or destroy your most productive employees. With AI becomes part of the solution. AI becomes, depending on the level and focus of the AI, one, it is, unless you program it to be this way, AI isn't concerned about promotion status, isn't concerned about salary, isn't concerned about getting credit. The AI is solely focused on the job it was programmed to do. And if that job it was programmed to do was to monitor employees, highlight employees that needed help, and then recommend the resources the employees should get in order to provide that help, I do believe you could create not only happier employees that are less stressed out because they're under-resourced and overworked, but you'd also create an organization that was much more focused on what a meta leadership model would require, and that's focused on the goal and not focused on individual accomplishment. And so the AI could, as an independent, largely unbiased, again, depending on programming, control element, could do a better job, I think, of assuring the employees that deserved recognition and promotion were recognized and promoted, and also identifying the employees that were either intentionally or unintentionally not performant, and the reasons for that lack of performance. And again, make recommendations on how to correct the problem, including terminating the employee if they were sequential abusers. In any company, you get a lot of folks that are just really good at politics and really bad at doing their job. BK at Intel was a good example of that. He was excellent at promoting himself, had no freaking clue how to run a company, and so the end result is basically where Intel is today, which is struggling to recover, as opposed to being the dynamic company it started out being under folks like Andy Grove. So AI blockchain could be used as a methodology to assure progress, using the transactions that are made between organizations and monitoring those transactions, and then flagging out if those transactions weren't being completed timely. Those promises, those commitments. And AI could be used not only as an element of the group, as a potential collaborative member of the overall effort, another resource to be properly used, but it could also be used to assure the organization was performing optimally, highlighting areas where it was underperforming and providing advice short of termination, but it could include termination, as to how to fix the problem. AI would be, if it was properly set up, would be less likely to shoot people first and ask questions later, and more likely to ask questions first, focus on resources, particularly focus on not remaking the same mistakes, because AIs do learn over time, and where replacing people often results in recurring mistakes, or in not correcting mistakes often results in recurring mistakes. I've certainly seen managers make the same mistake over and over again, and because they dodged repercussions, that mistake wasn't highlighted. Again, using General Electric as an example, the idea of forced ranking was a recurrent mistake that was made over and over again. And because it was held up as such a successful model, people didn't challenge the fact that it was absolutely non-performant and anything but a triage emergency company recovery. And it's very much like triage. You wouldn't use triage in general hospital operations. You have to use it in a catastrophe. AI would help you focus on using the appropriate tool for the appropriate problem. And it would also help you with how you manage your people and assure that the right people are being promoted and compensated, and that the people that are more politically oriented and non-performant were identified and removed from the process or retrained and sent to areas where, again, they could be performant. So it is the unbiased nature of AI that could be very beneficial here, and the nature of a distributed ledger that is automated that would be very helpful in terms of managing commitments and assuring that those commitments were both adequate and being met.
Thank you. This is excellent discussions. And I request all of my audience, please share my content as much as possible. See you next episode. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.